I'm Andrea, a passionate DEI advocate and consultant on a mission. Join me in each episode as we celebrate diversity, ignite conversations, and craft workplaces and educational institutions where everyone thrives. This podcast is my commitment to making a meaningful impact on the world of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So are you ready? Let's get Diversifused. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Get Diversifused podcast. I'm your host, Andrea Horton-Mericli, founder of Diversifuse Consulting and a passionate DEI advocate and ally. In today's episode, we will discuss Reconstructing DEI, how inclusion systems build anti-fragile organizations, with our guest speaker, Amri Johnson. For more than 20 years, Omri has been instrumental in helping organizations and their people create extraordinary business outcomes. He is a social capitalist, epidemiologist, entrepreneur, and inclusion strategist. Omri's dialogic approach to engaging all people as leaders and change agents has fostered the opening of minds and deepening of skill set with organizational leaders and citizens, enabling them to thrive and optimally contribute to one another and their respective organizations. As CEO and founder of Inclusion Wins, Omri and a virtual collective of partners converge organizational purpose to create global impact with a lens of inclusion. His theory of change is focused on building inclusion systems. His book, Reconstructing Inclusion, Making DEI Accessible, Actionable, and Sustainable, outlines how organizations can create inclusion normative cultures and build approaches to DEI that are designed for and with everyone, unambiguously prioritized and purpose-aligned. Born in Topeka, Kansas in the United States, Omri has worked and lived in the US, Brazil, and currently lives in Basel, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the city correctly, Basel, Switzerland, with his wife Martina and their 3 kids. So welcome, Omri, to the Get Diversifused podcast. Thank you so much for being our guest today.
Andrew, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And is it Basel or Basil, or how do you pronounce it?
It's Basel.
It is Basel.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Right. I guess correct.
But you'd be surprised. I mean, there's people that call it Basil and nobody corrects them, but it is Basel.
It is Basel. Okay,
Yeah.
Cool. Nice.
Yeah.
Woohoo. All right. Well, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and how you came to design the inclusion systems and also found Inclusion Wins?
Sure. Well, again, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here. So my kind of background in the whole diversity, equity, and inclusion space probably started when I was still growing up in Topeka, because my lens, I grew up pretty well. I mean, my father was an entrepreneur. My mother was an educator. She has a PhD in early childhood development. My dad was a mortician and owned mortuaries, and I came from a family of entrepreneurs all the way back to what we call Black Wall Street. So my family lived not in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, but outside of it, between Okmulgee and Boley, Oklahoma. So they were entrepreneurs into the late 19th century. So they into the 20th century. So I came from a family that really stuck together, but experienced the dynamics of racialization like anybody else that was a Black person. And it was never something that my family made any conversation about being a barrier. So it was always about, okay, you have some things that you're going to have to face. You have your family, you build, you learn, you do what you got to do. And when something comes up, we navigate it. And that's how, that was the framing that I had moving through life about racialization. So it was never like, you're Black, therefore there's something that you have to do differently. I never was told I had to work twice as hard. I was just told I better work hard. So there was no like twice. It's like, you better work hard and you better outwork the next person, right? Just because you just work, right? So that was kind of the framing I had. So my dad integrated public schools in Topeka, Kansas, where I grew up, and so I've basically been through this conversation since I was very young. And obviously my family talked about white people, like all Black families in America do, but it was never like, white people equals bad. It was sometimes because of the dynamics of the structures we live in, you have to navigate that. And there's a whole lot of people that have been wildly supportive of our family that don't have to happen to have the same shade of
Yeah.
skin or the same culture that they follow, but religiously, etc., business wise, people engaged together in my community, and the town I grew up in was pretty close to to the demographics of the United States. So I've been experiencing this kind of pluralistic, multicultural, however you want to frame it, world my whole
Hmm.
life. And so my framework for that kind of took me into public health. And so I went to college. I left Kansas. I went to college at Morehouse College, and there I got into public health. I had a great mentor named Bill Jenkins. He was one of the kind of he was the whistleblower on the Tuskegee syphilis experiment.
Oh,
So
interesting.
I just, I couldn't stand him when I met him because he challenged everything I thought. I was an arrogant kid, and he just kept pushing my buttons. And he was holding up mirrors, and that kind of mentor that held up that mirror so I could see myself
Hmm.
meant that I had to do it for myself because I didn't know how to operate without it, because he put it in front of us so much, and he was such a guide into my public health career that that's what I thought you're supposed to do. You're supposed to be holding up the mirror to yourself, and you're also supposed to be holding up the mirror with your colleagues so that we can all get better together.
Yes.
And so for me, that was my framing in public health as an epidemiologist after training at Emory. I went to Dr. Jenkins was also a Morehouse man. So that was kind of, that connection was there. And so, I left Morehouse, I went to Emory. And after I finished that, I went into my public health career. And a lot of that work was in health equity, health disparities. So the word equity was
Hmm.
not new to me. Like, a lot of people start hearing about equity over the past probably 6 or 7 years, but equity was always there, but it was about social determinants. And it wasn't about any particular group. It was about these social determinants. Sometimes your zip code meant that you were in a zip code that was predominantly people of African descent or
Hmm.
Black people. In other cases, it was like your zip code was poor and everybody was poor, and it didn't
Yeah.
matter what their culture was, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, to me, when I look at it from a health equity or a social determinants of health lens, public health lens, it was always about all of humanity and how could we reduce the harm or reduce the condition so that people could thrive and get back to health or prevent something from happening that might get in the way of their health. So as I moved from public health into, and that I'm not going to go into because I'm already long, but I'm not going to go into the story of
No,
how
no,
I
I'm
did
finding
that.
this fascinating. I love hearing people's stories.
Yeah, well, I was in public health, and it just occurred to me that I wasn't really good at managing people, and that's when I got obsessed about organizations, leadership, etc.
Hmm.
Before I even knew about what we call DEI now, I had no
Yeah.
clue about it, and I ended up uh, uh, getting so obsessed with organizational development, effectiveness, leadership, strategy, that I decided that that's what I wanted to do for a career. So I slowly started working with some of my friends that were doing that, just kind of tagging along, doing it for free. Some of my skills from public health transferred, to
Hmm.
be able to facilitate groups and things like that. When I was doing the preliminary elements of a epidemiological study, it was all there. So my research background helped. And then I made a pivot. I started a business that was all kind of consulting, a lot of strategy, a lot of organizational development, facilitation, and I
Hmm.
also basically self-taught. I learned on the go. And at that time, I saw a niche in the job boards were starting. So you had Monster.com and Career Builder, and you start seeing these niche job boards. And I was
Hmm.
like, oh, that sounds like a good business. And I found a vendor that could help me start one. So I started one first called Georgia Health Works. It was for the region of the Southeast US. And then I
Hmm.
started a national one called Diversity Health Works because I
Oh,
was working in cultural competence, and I
yeah.
wanted to build a network of people who were committed to doing that work. And so the job board was the entry point. Before everybody was building communities like they are today, I was working to
Mhm.
build a community related to cultural competence, health equity. and I created a whole framework around it, blah, blah, blah. And so I did that, and I was like, yeah, this is good. It's working. I got about 200, 300 people in my little kind of small network. Have some people asking me to come do some work with them here and there, but I couldn't grow a scale of business that way. So I was like, I need to learn about this whole, what are these other diversity people doing? Because I heard about them, but I didn't know much about it. So I started cold calling a bunch of them. One of them reached out to me, Leslie Traub, who was one of the principals at Cook Ross, and eventually her husband, Howard Ross, who was the founder of the company. Howard brought me in. I drove to Nashville in just, about 4 hours to watch him do a presentation at a hospital. I was like, wow, this is cool. Wow. You can do that and they pay you? Like, oh, I'm in. So we started working together. I became a partner there for a while, built that up. And then a few years later, we decided that we weren't going to partner long term. And I pivoted. And when I pivoted, I went back to running my firm full time. I still own my job boards and my consultancy. And I got called by Novartis to come and build out the research division of Novartis's DEI work. And so all of this is in Reconstructing, some of it, not all of it, but a good amount of it is in Reconstructing Inclusion. But from there, that's when the inclusion system started evolving. It started emerging in like 2012, 2013 for me. So all the components around organizational networks and social capital, the components around cultural intelligence, and of course, inclusion systems design and development, that whole theory of change came to life there. And so I did the book, Reconstructing Inclusion and Making DEI Accessible, Actionable, and Sustainable, came to me around 2014. And I was kind of building these stories around it because we were putting this into practice. So I didn't just write a book about inclusion systems. We were creating an inclusion system inside of the research division of Novartis and touched the entire enterprise of Novartis, which is the city that I live in. Novartis is based. And so I was doing this work all over the world, building these systems, thinking about systems more than just symptoms, and working on that in a way that said, okay, how do we build the systems that create the conditions for everybody to thrive, and create something beyond just profit? And so that was the long story from my entry point, where I've always thought about systems. I've always thought about everybody. I know there are disparities. I started my career in that space, but the focus on what we don't want usually gets us that. Does that make sense? Right?
It does.
If we focus on what we don't want, we'll get it. I wanted to focus on what we were looking to create. And so inclusion systems are about what we want to create, not what we're trying to, avoid or try to rectify from the past. And then that's and then when you think about some of the challenges that we're facing in DEI today, it's because we spend most of our time in the paradigm of fixing the past. So I'll pause there for a second, but that's kind of the story from inception of Omri being in the world till now, and not including my moves around the world and all that. So
that's just fascinating. I love that you took the initiative to cold call. It's like, I need to find out,
Exactly.
And that somebody actually responded.
Oh yeah. It was about 15. I'd say I'd reach out to 15 different consultants, smaller and bigger. 3 of them responded. 1 of them was interested in, giving me a chance.
That's awesome. Wow. So I lost my question. It just popped out of my head. Oh my gosh. So I'm going to ask one of the prepared questions while I try to remember what the question was that popped in my head and just went poof. Okay. So what is the inclusion systems framework, and how does it differ from traditional DEI approaches?
I think I started off saying, a lot of DEI approaches are based on, like, Roosevelt Thomas. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's really a pioneer in the diversity and inclusion space. He's created strategic diversity management, and he had a framework around these social justice paradigms, civil rights social justice paradigms, and the performance paradigms. And there were four of them. One of them revolved around righting past wrongs. It was, let's get it right from all the stuff that happened badly to people who have been marginalized in any capacity. The other one is around the golden rule. These are, do unto others. Those were the social justice, civil rights paradigms. The performance paradigms are around everybody getting what they need individually to make their best contribution, and looking at diversity as something that touches everything and it's more systemic. And that's my reduction of his paradigms. But that really kind of has informed my work, because a lot of people focus on the social justice and civil rights paradigms exclusively. And when you do, and that's why the whole equity thing is really big, because people are not necessarily working on behalf of organizations. They're trying to tackle big social problems.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to do. And so I never wanted to tackle big social problems. Now, if I was able to address those, because inside of organizations and companies where we spend so much of our time, and we learn some skills and capacity to better connect and understand each other, and work through the tensions and complexities of the differences or the barriers that we create between one another. If we learn to do that, we probably will apply it to our daily lives too.
Yeah.
But I've been more focused on organization. So an inclusion system is us designing inclusion to be normative in organizational life. So it's about capability building and ongoing building of capabilities with any input. And so I'll give an example later, but it can be any input, behavioral, structural. It can be learning, and any action that creates the conditions for people to thrive is how I define inclusion. And inclusion systems is based on that. But when we have those inputs, Andrea, and let me know if this is making sense so far.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Okay. But when we have those inputs, it's through all of our humanity. And I look at humanity kind of as the center of an inclusion system. And when you're designing one and continuing to develop it, the humanity is the superset. And our diverse attributes, whether they're inherent or acquired, are the subsets. And there's so many of them, and they mash up against each other like particles. And they come together in different ways in organizational life, but you have to address it completely. It doesn't mean that there might not be certain needs for a particular identity group, but usually even within that identity group, like I say, I'm Black. You probably figured that out by now. The way somebody might address Black people in one organization is different. I'll tell a story a little later about my niece. She's undergone, experienced something over the past few years that shifted her identity, right? She's a mixed race girl, but she had something that happened, and the way she sees the world, probably because I've raised her, because my brother passed when she was really young, and the family we both came from, the way she's dealt with that situation is very different than I imagine some people might have dealt with it, right? Culturally, she's very much an African-American young lady, but the way she engages is never around, this is why I have the problem that I might have, is because I have this particular culture, right? So when you're developing an inclusion system, these inputs need to be about the systems that you want to address, and how you can address them not once or twice, but address them as a way of being, address them as a way of engaging and shifting and making your culture more anti-fragile, meaning when you have a hardship, you can bounce back higher. But the idea is that all the outputs are always around thriving people in generative cultures. So these inputs can be anything, and I'll give an example in a second. They can be anything. They're not fixated on being an ally or unconscious bias training or learning about a particular single identity or ERGs. All of those could be on the table, but they're about the system. and not necessarily focused on single identities, but really how did these things contribute to the entire humanity of the organization in which I work in or exist in or contribute to. So the
Yeah.
outputs are always thriving people and generative culture. What do I mean by thriving people? People thrive when they feel like they're aligned, they're making a contribution, they're learning, they're feeling like their intrinsic motivation is stimulated, they're
Hmm.
getting appropriate rewards for their work, they are feeling like they are acknowledged for their work, and they're constantly able to build their capacity. It isn't even always about the next promotion. If
Hmm.
people feel like they're growing and making a substantive contribution, they're usually thriving. They have strong, healthy relationships inside of the organizational system, right? The
Hmm.
organizational mind is one that says we want to help you develop, and we're committed to that, and people feel like they're part of that belonging
Yeah.
thing, you know. That's thriving. And generative culture means a culture that wants to build something beyond just um, profit. Like, I like profit. Don't get me wrong. Profit is good. Greed is not good. Profit is good.
Yeah.
Being able to generate revenue to do good things for your employees, to do good things for your other stakeholders, shareholders, whatever, that's good. But if that's all you're about, you're probably going to be a short-lived entity.
Hmm.
And there's a really brilliant body of research around that by Ari DeHose. He wrote a book called The Learning Company. He talks about puddle companies versus river companies. So I'm not going to go into that, but that's that. It's we want to build river companies. So inclusion systems are always about the inputs that create the conditions for everybody to thrive. And even if that intervention is based on a subset of that
Hmm.
humanity, all humanity benefits from it, because it can't be that some benefit and others feel like they don't, because it doesn't necessarily work. It's like those contributions, people have to see, wow, that's going to might not benefit me individually, but it benefits the organization to be more generative and people to thrive. And
Yeah.
therefore, I can make my contribution to it, and everybody can get what they need so the organization can be healthy. So that's the idea. And then, of course, it's measurement and all the stuff that goes
Data.
under that. But that's the
Yeah.
notion of inclusion system. And if I may, I'll do a quick example.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. Please do.
So I was working with a group of people in drug discovery. The biggest issue in drug discovery is safety. So everybody
Hmm.
is trying to make sure all medicines are safe. So there's groups of people that are focused on safety, and I was working with
Okay.
one of the groups of people that are completely focused on safety. They're looking at all the things that you have to do, all the things that the FDA says and other drug approval agencies around the world say that you have to do to make sure that your drug is safe. So they're
Hmm.
very important, and they usually know more about drug discovery and development than most people in organizations. But they also bring bad news, Andrea, because if something's not going right or there's a safety concern, they have to bring
Hmm.
it to the team and say, hey, there's a safety concern.
Yeah.
Here's what you're going to have to do. And that usually means you have to slow your study down. Most
Uh,
studies don't work. Like the majority of
um,
studies, companies spend a lot of money on these studies, and most of them don't work. So when you get slowed down, you're like, oh, don't talk to those people unless you have to, right? And so that was what was happening. Is they would come in and they were structured just to be like an add-on to the team. They weren't really
mm,
fully feeling integrated. So they came to me. Now, what I write about this in Reconstructing Inclusion, but what I don't write is the people that came to me were predominantly women.
mm,
And so I could have said, you know what? They're not listening to the women, or
yeah.
they're marginalizing the women. But you know what I didn't do?
Hmm.
Any of that, because it didn't matter, because it was impacting the organization's ability to perform.
Yeah.
And so it didn't matter if that they were women, because what we found is that it was impacting everybody. The people that came to me happened to be women. The men were just like, oh, we just deal with it, right? The women were like, I don't think this is really working. We're not even be able to make our best contribution. So we
Hmm.
we we taught them about contracting from Peter
Hmm.
Block's book, Flawless Consulting. So we taught them about contracting, and we did a workshop on contracting, and they learned how to contract with the drug discovery team. The team leads They went to them. They had these conversations about, here's what I need. Here's what we can do for you. And they were like, you can do all that? And they were like, yeah. And they were like, does that work for you? And the team leads were like, well, of course, that's amazing. Why weren't we getting that all along? And then they said, well, this is why, and this is what we need from you. And if we get off the mark, here's how we can get back on. Does that make sense? And they were like, yeah. And so we learned this skill. They took it in. And as a result, they were a part of the meetings after the meetings before the meeting, the ad hoc meetings. They were just getting included.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just the women who were a part of that group. It was everybody. Some did it better than others. It wasn't a panacea, but it gave them a tool that they could use not just once, but over and over again when they enter into those situations. Could it have been some gender dynamics going on? Absolutely. But was it something that was important for me to bring up? Because I noticed it. I wasn't sitting there. still a DEI guy. I'm noticing these things. But was it worth me saying it's the women and it's this and the women need this? No, it was worth me saying this is about all of us. This is impacting all of us. The result was they started moving projects forward faster. They had less delays. They were able to anticipate problems before they happened. And the team members felt like they were more involved in being a part of the team rather than just almost like being a service provider, even though they were full-time employees in the company.
Yeah, bad news givers.
That's what everybody made them. But then they became, they flagged this before it became bad news, so we didn't have to deal with it downstream. We were able to deal with it upstream. By the way, when you deal with things upstream, that's how equity actually happens.
Oops.
Yeah, equity is something that we deal with upstream. So that's an example of building an inclusion system. You have this input. The output is that the people were able to thrive as a result of the input, and everybody benefited from it. And that's what I mean by accessible to everyone, prioritized unambiguously, because it was about the business. And of course, the purpose of those teams were to bring medicines to market to help human life.
That's awesome. It sounds like one, I have to say that I love that the center's the humanity. I always believe in the human-centered approach first, because we're such complex creatures, and it all has to stem from the humanity of it all.
Sure.
But it also sounds like everything is very communication heavy as well.
Absolutely.
It's like, then and that's what we really have to think about. It's like all the different communication styles. How do people receive communication best? How are people giving communication? Are they giving their communication in different ways? Or, all these things need to be thought about. And then how is it trickling down? So it's almost like that. I don't know what that child's game is. Like the cow jumped over the moon, and you're in a circle, and then by the end, it's like,
You definitely can't say it once, right?
Yeah.
The thing about telephone that gets in the way is you only have one shot, right? You have one shot, and then you stop. But that's not life. And so these are iterative approaches. Inclusion, diversity, equity, inclusion to me is a relational construct. If we can build stronger relationships and we're intentional about it, and we can identify when there's stressors or tension in there, and then we can get better as a result of it, that's really, to me, when inclusion, diversity, equity, inclusion makes the biggest difference. Not when we right past wrongs, because if we relate to each other better and we see who each other is, we'll right the wrongs because we'll really see each other. And sometimes we do stuff that makes us not see each other. We see an idea of somebody. We see them, because they're from a particular culture, that's who they are. But that's not who they are. That's just one aspect or characteristic of them, but that's not who they are. We want to know not what people are, but who people are. And I got a colleague that talks about that a lot. Who are you? And we can only do that through connection. We cannot do that through, breaking each other into various groups and saying we shouldn't be together. And that's what we talk about, why DEI has failed. in the past few years, because I didn't know this DEI. This was a new DEI to me when I came back out of being internal. I was like, what
Mm-hmm.
is this? You separate people? Like, I'm not doing that. I never
Yeah.
allowed it inside. I'm not going to allow it in my firm, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's about the connection. It's about the relational aspects of it, and getting better at that every day, because it's not something that you stop. We don't have a DEI. We've achieved DEI. Like we've
Mm-hmm.
finished a marathon. It's multiple
Yeah.
marathons over multiple years with different runners.
Yeah. And yeah, I totally agree with you. It's like you can't separate, because in order for progress to happen, and in an organization or in an educational institution, we have to come together and work together. And so with that, we have to be able to communicate,
Yeah,
um, and know each other's strengths and weaknesses and how we can complement each other. And that's not
absolutely.
going to happen unless we communicate. And so I love it when teams do like those assessments on each other, those personality assessments on each other, because it's very eye-opening to the person doing it on themselves. Like, oh man, this is so me. But then when you see some of your colleagues' personality assessment results, it's like, oh wow, that is so you. And then you can see how you guys can complement each other.
Yeah, it opens up a
It
conversation,
it
and
does.
that's and sometimes mine has changed in the past,
Of
right?
course, yeah.
And I've
Yeah.
been able to talk about how that has shifted too. So there's lots of when you talk about communication, it's always there, and we don't do enough
Hmm.
of it.
Yeah,
And with hybrid, we have to be more intentional about it, for example,
exactly.
because we can lose connection. I think the pandemic actually sometimes made us less personal, things less personal with us.
Hmm.
Like there's certain stuff that people wouldn't say in person
Hmm.
that created problems because they said it over, our digital really rendered
Yeah.
images.
A
It's not.
message chat or
It's
something. Yeah.
exactly, and that's
Mhm.
where we have better opportunity to do better in that regard.
Right.
So,
I agree. And a lot of most jobs, I wouldn't say most jobs, but there's a large percentage of jobs that are hybrid, and as opposed to remote or in person, fully in person. And so it's very important for organizations to reframe things
sure,
and learn different ways to promote success of teams. So
absolutely, absolutely.
So I I remembered my question.
Okay.
So let's jump back to the beginning of the podcast here. So I loved that your family, it's not that they didn't bring up the past, but they didn't use it as a uh for lack of a better term, excuse and stuff, because the
Yeah,
past
yeah,
is not the future. You are in control of yourself today, and it'll impact your future. Whatever you do today impacts the future. The past is the past. It's over
yeah,
and done with.
yeah.
We can't change it. Whether it's a good whether it was a good past or a bad past or whatever may have happened, it's over and done with. And it's but humans, many humans, we tend to focus on that and get stuck in
Yeah,
that rut of the past. And yeah, it's important to know history.
absolutely,
Definitely learn your
absolutely.
history, learn your facts, and learn from them. Sorry, my
Yeah,
camera keeps getting stuck. I apologize.
no problem, no problem.
Learn from them, and from the past, our past mistakes, our past successes, because we've all had them,
No doubt.
mistakes and successes, no matter who you are, where you come from, what color you are, what culture you come from. It doesn't matter.
Hmm.
It's what we do with that information that's
Absolutely.
important. So,
That's and that's where I think look, sometimes you're working stuff out that you've had to work out.
mhm,
Being having some traumatic experiences is real, and you have to have enough self-awareness to know that, it's not your job is not to work out your past challenges with clients. That is not
mhm,
your job. And I think sometimes people fall into that. And that's a certain level of kind of skill that you have to build, that you can bring you have to use yourself in that, but you're not using yourself as the focus. You're using yourself as an instrument, as a vehicle
Mm.
to engage with people in organizational life, and knowing enough about yourself to know
Mhm.
when something might be getting in the way of that, and how can you not necessarily step away, but
Yeah.
step back into the world of those people who are the heroes of the story. And those are the people inside the organizations that you're working with, whether
Mhm.
you're the internal practitioner or you're a consultant like we are, right? You have to be able to know what your role is to do enough nudging here and there to get people to move into action about something that creates the conditions for people to thrive. And you can't be a barrier to that because you're working something out
Yeah.
from that harmed you or made you feel
Mhm.
a certain way in the past. I
Right.
get it.
Mhm.
You feeling that way, holler at me. I'll work through it with you as a fellow practitioner. But don't take that into the client, because what
Mhm.
it does is it creates an analogy. And then so
Yeah.
you get an analogy and people are like, I don't want to do this work anymore. Like everybody talks
Mhm.
about difficult conversations, but sometimes they're talking about conversations that are about them, about something they
That's true.
experienced or something that somebody they know or cared about experienced, and they want to tell you all the stuff that you need to not do because of that, blah blah blah
Mhm.
blah blah. I'm
Yeah.
sorry, it doesn't work. If it worked, I'd probably be into it, Andrea, but it doesn't. And now we're seeing
Mhm.
the outputs of it. And so did I experience some like racist stuff? Of course. I'm a black man, I'm 6'3",
Mhm.
240 pounds. Like, I'm big, I'm a large human. You don't think I experienced it? Yes.
Yeah.
And um uh focusing on it or dwelling on it has never with a client wasn't helpful.
Mhm.
Did
Yeah.
they ask me and I tell them the stories? Yeah. But has it happened that much? Not really. Relatively, no. When it happened, did I know how to deal with it? Yes. And most of the time, there was no power asymmetry. It was just somebody, feeling themselves, and they did what they did. But I just was like, okay, you got to do what you got to do. And sometimes I said something and sometimes I didn't. And so, and that was me. And I'm not saying I want everybody to be like me, but know
Mhm.
why you're in it for. If you're in it
Yeah.
for the people that you're working on behalf of, the communities
Mhm.
that you're trying to pull together, it can't be about you.
Mhm.
You're not the star of the show. The people are. And that's hard to do if you haven't done your own personal work. You can't go any deeper than you can
Mhm.
go yourself with your clients, and letting them go deep into how they can move actions forward that create the conditions for everybody to thrive.
I love that. I love that. I mean, that's so true. You got to work on yourself first before you
Yeah,
can help others
yeah,
work up the processes and on themselves.
yeah.
And
We're back to
so,
those mirrors, right?
exactly. Oh, and I love that's another
You
thing.
know,
I love that. Some talk about being actual reflection. Self reflection. I love that that
yeah.
he actually used mirrors. So that is amazing. I mean, what was his name again?
Bill Jenkins, Dr.
Bill
Bill
Jenkins.
Jenkins. Yeah,
I'm gonna
he's
write his
he's
name down.
legendary on so many levels.
So, speaking of DEI initiatives and all, why do you think so many DEI initiatives fail? And what can organizations do differently to avoid common pitfalls?
I mentioned it a little bit
A
earlier,
little
but
bit.
I think the biggest thing is to focus on the fact that this is about everybody. It's not just about the so-called marginalized. Like sometimes when people call people marginalized because of their group identity, I kind of
Mhm.
laugh because I'm
Yeah.
like, I mean, so a black billionaire is a marginalized person. Like, when you think about it like that, you're like, and is somebody who's multi generations of physicians or surgeons, are they and happen to be,
Mhm.
Latino, does that make them marginalized? Like, I don't know how we frame
Yeah.
that. I think being very clear about what we're trying to create for organizations is a big part of that. So when we think about we're trying to
Yeah.
create equity, like what does that mean? If I'm saying I want equitable systems, it's not that everybody's going to get the same thing at the end. It's that we're creating the conditions for everybody to get what they need to thrive. And
Mhm.
if there's a barrier that's getting in the way of that, we need to remove it. So it's more preventative. And so what we've been doing is trying to treat the problem. And it's usually a big societal problem. Like
Yeah.
racism is a huge societal problem. It still exists. But to
Around the
go into
world.
an organization and say, I'm
Mhm.
going to tackle racism in this kind of macro sense versus behaviors in the kind of real sense, those behaviors are probably toxic to more than just people that are so-called marginalized.
No,
They're probably
definitely.
toxic to everybody. So
Yeah.
address the behavior. In what we do, oftentimes we've been addressing people's identities. And so why it hasn't worked is a lot of the work has been an identity of identity approach. If you read Reconstructing Inclusion, I'm not really even big on identity focused employee resource groups. People think I'm a little crazy around that. I think single identity ERGs, if it's of a group and everybody can engage so that they're connecting with people across various differences and similarities, great. But if it's just for a group to create a safe space, yeah, occasionally you can caucus, but you don't need to make caucus your main thing. You need to make contact your main thing. So I talk about this a lot in my new work around what we call the emergent inclusion system. I talk about contact over caucus. So contact is how separate but equal was overturned, and Brown overturned separate but equal and segregation in schools.
Mm-hmm.
It was because contact theory and the contact hypothesis. And so we want more contact with people. We want more connection. We want people to see who each other is across these differences and similarities to remove some of those barriers by being in contact and having a common goal, which is the organizational purpose.
Yeah.
And when you're clear about the organizational mission and purpose, and that you're clear that
Yes.
everybody should be doing their best work, and I'm going to do everything I can to help people get there, we want to go from here to where we might not be in contact to being in more contact than we've ever been in. And so a lot of DEI approaches have actually done the opposite. We've said, oh, we've been in contact, but it doesn't feel good when we're in contact. So let's go back to not being in contact.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does. It does. Like,
Right?
let's just not
And
socialize.
so you can't go from separation. You can't go from contact to separation. You have to go from any kind of sense of separation as if we're not interdependent, because we are. In organizational life, there's an interdependent notion that just exists. Interdependence is a thing. It's not something that I made up. You are interdependent if you're in an organization. You're all bound by the organization's reason that your reason for being. You have to go from this to this. And if you don't, you probably won't know and build the skills to deal with all the tension that comes along with that. And you probably won't, extend the potential of the organization. And just like a puddle, you'll dry up
Yeah.
versus a river that just keeps going and changing and dealing with all the ecosystem that interacts with the river and all the things that are in the river and on the sides of the river and go in the river and get cleaned out of the river and all these things in that metaphor, right? You can't do that the way a lot of DEI work has been put forth. And kind of combining really big social macro issues with things that organizations need to be concerned with. It's just too hard. And it's not hard because it's bad. It's hard because it's so hard that it's hard to sustain it. If you do the things, the hygiene factors all the time, you can sustain it, and you can see some of those societal things that we want to change come about because we've had more contact with each other about what might be happening both inside and outside the organization that we can do something about. But mostly the things inside, because we've connected on who we are, and we want everybody to win. When inclusion wins, everyone wins, right? And so that's kind of why I think there's a challenge. There's a lot of other probably underlying things that I could talk about, but primarily we haven't focused on contact and connection and creating the conditions with each other. We've often resorted to blaming one another rather than creating the conditions of what we want and focusing on what we want instead of what we don't.
And I never really thought about it, but you mentioned ERGs and stuff, and you're right. A lot of ERGs and organizations, you have your Latino or your Latinx ERG, you have your LGBTQ plus or
Mm-hmm.
ERG, you have your Black and African American ERG, you have your um, I don't know what other veterans ERG,
Yeah.
and they have their meet. I mean, granted, anybody can be join any ERG. You don't have to identify as Latinx to be a part of Latinx ERG, or identify as LGBTQ plus to be a part of the LGBTQ. I can never say LGBTQ plus ERG.
Yeah.
I always get tongue tied. But most people don't. They only join it. They'll join the people who join those ERGs usually identify as that, and or at least that's one of their.
It can be a very self-indulging endeavor.
Yeah.
Because we want to do that because it helps me.
Yeah.
All good. Everybody wants to help me. I'm team me as well, but I'm not so team me that I think that I'm separate from somebody and that I'm not there to contribute to the organization's success.
Mm-hmm.
There are things that culturally that you can really add value to the organization.
Mm-hmm.
But do you want just you to know that, or do you want as many people as possible to engage in those conversations and develop relationships around that? So if these single identity, as I call them, ERGs, are building the capacity for greater relational capacity within them, then fantastic. But if they're doing things that actually subvert that unintentionally, then it's problematic long term.
Yeah, and that's such a great point, and that's something that organizations really need to assess if they do have ERGs or ENGs, whatever. Or I think EBGs, sorry, ERGs or EBGs, if they're called something else as well. They need to assess them to see how they're actually functioning in their organization, and if they are like isolated from each other.
Exactly. That's it, Andrew.
Yeah. So cool. So, in your book, Reconstructing Inclusion, you discuss making DEI accessible and sustainable. Could you, and can you share another example of this action?
Sure. What I, in that story I told you about with the safety team, they, the reason I mentioned about that most of them were women is because it needed to be accessible to everybody. Because if I would have gone in and said, these women came to me and they said,
it's going to be all about them.
They said these women are having problems, and you blokes over here need to do something about it. And you know what they would have been like? Well, how do we know? We never heard this before. Versus focusing on the behavior and the problem. Then they learned a skill. They build a capability that can be sustained because they can use that in almost every situation they go into. So sustainability comes through one, building the skills and capabilities, and it also comes because this is really clearly tied to why the organization does what it does. So you get everybody in and know this is about all, even if you're doing intervention and focus on a particular group, fine, but it needs to be about everybody benefiting from it. That means that it's tied to the organizational mission and purpose. And that's how you build sustainability. That the notion of sustainability in the title is that it's aligned with organizational purpose. So anything we do is going to move us in that direction, and in the terms of the work we do with clients, pulling as many people in to understand that they are influencing this and they're being influenced by it, and then you get a level of support. This unambiguous priority, the actionable part, is an unambiguous prioritization of it. Like this is prioritized because we believe it's important to the organization and believe it's important to organization. It's important to everybody. And so that's kind of the pull through there.
I love that. Oh, wow. So this has been such a great conversation. I'm going to be putting all those resources you said on one of the ending slides of our podcast today, as well as a link to your book where listeners can access so they can purchase it. And I'll also be putting it in the summary of our podcast. So Reconstruction Inclusion, great book, great man who wrote the book.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. And this has just been so eye-opening even for me. And it's just, I love doing these podcasts because I learn something from my guests
Absolutely.
each time.
Yeah, of course.
And it's just been wonderful. So let's go into some key takeaways because I do want to be cognizant of your time. I know it's pretty late over there. And then I'll ask you if there's anything that I may have missed. So listeners, Omri and I spoke about understanding the inclusions framework. He went into a very good in-depth explanation of it. And we learned how to create anti-fragile organizations that thrive through disruption by leading into resistance and stressors. We talked about why DEI efforts sometimes and often backfire, and discovered common pitfalls that traditional DEI initiatives have and how to implement sustainable strategies that engage everyone. We talked about the power of cultural intelligence and uncovered how enhancing cultural intelligence directly influences business outcomes and bottom line results. And we talked about inclusion for all, not just select groups. Again, DEI is for everyone. And it's called something else. It's been called many things over history, but now it's called DEI, but it's for everyone. And we explore some practical strategies for making inclusion an organizational norm, benefiting everyone in the workplace. And we talked about actionable change management and gained some insights on how to align DEI strategies with the organization's purpose to create lasting impact and resilience. I was about to say resistance, not resistance, resilience. Are there any other key takeaways I may have missed, Omri?
No, I think you hit it. I didn't talk as much about cultural intelligence as I would have, but I think it's a capability. I think everybody should learn about CQ. And one of my colleagues, David Livermore, is one of the he's one of the lights in the CQ work globally. And if you haven't, he has a new version of his book, Leading with Cultural Intelligence, out. So I do recommend that. And it's been a big part of how I work with organizations when it comes to education. Cultural intelligence is a big part.
That's actually in my cart on Amazon, actually.
It's worth it. I think everybody should learn about it if they're serious about DEI, because it's one of the only kind of constructs that is really skills building, because there's a lot of components to CQ, and I think everybody should to get their arms around it.
I agree. CQ and EQ are even more important than IQ to me. So
absolutely. In many ways. Yeah,
definitely. All right, so listeners, let's go into some next steps, some calls to action, if you will, so you can expand on what Omri discussed in today's podcast. So assess your organization's DEI initiatives using the Inclusion Systems Framework to identify areas for improvement. Increase cultural intelligence training for leaders and teams to enhance their ability to navigate diverse environments. Implement strategies to foster inclusion at all levels of the organization, top down, making it a central part of your business operations. Read Omri's book, Reconstructing Inclusion, which as I said, I will be putting the link in the last slide and in our summary today. Read it for a deeper understanding of building sustainable DEI efforts. And engage with DEI professionals like Omri or consultants to create tailored, actionable strategies for your organization. Any other next steps you have for our listeners, Omri?
No, I mean, of course, the most important one is Reconstructing Inclusion. Just kidding, but no. It's I think we have to keep holding the mirrors up to ourselves, like the metaphorical mirrors to ourselves about how we can get better and make better contributions to organizational life. And that's a nonstop learning, and every single day getting better at doing that. Just like you would want to get better at anything, you have to learn how to get better at that. So holding up the mirror is the first step, and just seeing yourself, seeing what you're doing that's either advancing that or getting in the way. That's an important piece to me.
I agree, and that goes with all behaviors. That doesn't have to be DEI focused, but all behaviors, because we all have these unconscious behaviors that we're unaware of, inactions, and so really being self-reflective is very important. That's, as you had said earlier in our conversation, we have to work on ourselves first before we can help others improve themselves.
Absolutely.
So, Omri, how can our listeners get a hold of you if they want to contact you to be a speaker or co-author, or they want to be a client, or they just want to be
you can always you can always go to our website at inclusionwins.com. I'm on LinkedIn pretty frequently, either our company page or directly to me, Amri Johnson or Amri B. Johnson. And we have a podcast, a Reconstructing Inclusion podcast, as well as a Substack of the same name. All of those are places that you could reach out. We'd love to hear from you and get feedback. And we put out a lot of content. So anything that you feel resonates with you and you want to learn more, whether you want to work with me directly or not, I'm always open for a conversation with interesting people. So just reach out.
Awesome. Thank you, Omri. So listeners, I will have all Omri's contact information on one of the last slides of our podcast. And as always, it'll be in the summary as well. So you won't have to scroll through the end to see it if you don't listen to the entire podcast, which I hope you would, but it's not required. All right, listeners. Remember, our episodes launch every Thursday, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. So check out our episode this coming Thursday. And as always, we are always welcoming comments from our listeners. Feel free to comment on our YouTube channel or our Spotify channel of our podcast. Let us know what you'd like to hear in future episodes, or if you liked a podcast, a certain episode or not. And subscribe to our podcast channel. We love to have subscribers. And as always, I will let you go. Stay diversifused. I'll talk to you later. Bye. Want to be a guest speaker on the Get Diversifused podcast? I'm on the lookout for guests, so if you're passionate about DEI and would like to share your unique insights, experiences, or success stories, I want to hear from you. If you're a fellow podcaster who's passionate about DEI, let's swap the mic and amplify each other's voices. If you're interested in being a guest, reach out to me at Andrea@diversifuse.com and I'll send you the link to our guest interest form. Hope to hear from you soon. Remember, stay diversifused. Now go out there and make a difference. And as always, for more strategies on building inclusive workplaces and communities, check out Diversifuse. We're here to guide you on your DEI journey. Make sure to visit our website at diversifuse.com and follow us on social media for the latest happenings, blog posts, tips, and events.